Hey there, wire weaver. Do you struggle with wire weaving tension? I sure did when I was starting out, and today I've got a design for you that's going to really help you develop a feel for your wire weaving tension. My name is Wendy, and I'm the wire weaver behind Door 44. If you'd like to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. Today is the official kickoff of the Twig Pendant Make-Along. This is part 1, and today we're going to talk about balling the ends of wire and assembling the pendant up to the point where we complete the weave. Now there are just a couple of housekeeping items to take care of before we get started. First, make sure you look down in the description. There you're going to find two links. One is to the companion workbook that goes along with this tutorial. You can download that and follow along. Secondly, in that description, you're going to find another link that goes to my blog, and that's a project resource guide. That's going to give you access to all of the materials and tools that I use in this tutorial, including some that I don't use in the written part of the tutorial. So there are some additional tools I'm going to be using here in these videos, and if you'd like to know what those are and where to find them, make sure you go look at that project resource guide. Alright, so let's get started. I am going to begin with 3 pieces of 18 gauge wire. I've cut these to 5.5 inches long. And this is dead soft solid copper wire. I buy this at Rio Grande. And don't forget that there's a project resource guide on my blog. There's a link in the description here. Just go to that page and you'll find links to everything that I use in this tutorial. I'll link to the original sources that I use and also some alternate sources if you want to buy smaller amounts. I buy my wire in bulk from Rio Grande in 1-pound rolls. That's a lot of wire for somebody who's, if you're just a hobbyist, you may not want that much wire. So I will also provide some alternative sources for smaller quantities of wire. Now you can see here, I've got my torch set up. I'm going to go ahead and ball the ends of these wires, and my quenching bowl is just here out of frame. I have this set up exactly as I did in the tutorial video that I did recently, showing you how to just the basics of using a torch and also how to ball wire. So if you're unfamiliar with this process, I'm probably going to move pretty quickly here. I'll provide a link to that video. Just look up here in the upper right hand corner of the screen and you'll see that link. And in that tutorial I walk you through the whole process of everything you need to know about using your torch, how to fuel it, how to start it, how to extinguish the flame, where all the controls are, what they do. And I also talk about pickle and how to maintain and use pickle. So go ahead and watch that video now if you're not familiar with this process. Otherwise, let's just go ahead and get started. So one of the things I talked about in my earlier video on balling wire with a torch is where exactly to put your tip in the flame. You want to be right in front of that inner cone of your flame. So we're just going to heat this whole shaft of wire, and by pointing that wire straight into the flame like that, I heat up that wire evenly, and that helps give me a better result. So I'm just going to go ahead and ball one end of each of these 3 wires to start with. And notice how I start with a wire horizontally pointing straight into the flame, and then I tip it up. And that's just to sort of work with gravity and get that ball to center on the shaft of your wire. If you leave it in the flame horizontally too long, the ball will start to drop, gravity will take over, and you'll end up with a little bit of a lopsided ball on the end. Now that doesn't make a huge difference in this particular design because of the nature of the design. It can make a difference in some designs, so just make sure that if you use this technique that you tip that wire up early while your ball is still developing to keep your ball centered on the shaft of the wire. Now if you notice that your balls are developing a little bit of a point at the end, that's an indication that you're getting too close to that cooler part of the flame. As I mentioned in my tutorial video on torches, that bright inner core flame is the cooler part of the flame. So if you get the tip of your wire into that cool part, it's going to create a point at the end of your wire And that's because the flame just isn't quite hot enough there. So that's one little troubleshooting tip for you. If you notice that your balls are developing sort of a sharp pointy tip at the end, just pull your wire back a little bit. You want the tip of that wire to be just in front of that cone, but not in it. All right, so those wires are done. I've got balls on 2 of these wires. I balled both ends. You can see these 2 here. And then one wire, I just want a ball on one end to start with. We'll ball this up toward the end of the process, but we need to go ahead and put our bead on there first. So I'm just going to drop these in my pickle, and then we'll pick up from there. This is the wire that I just balled on one end, and this is going to be our center core wire. Now this wire sort of presented an opportunity to show you. Do you see that pointy little tip there? That's because I did get too close to the inner cone of my flame when I was heating this wire up, and so I ended up with kind of a sharp little point there. And I'm just going to knock that off using my 400 grit sanding stick. So don't be afraid to go ahead and touch up the balls of your wires if they're not quite perfect. Just grab a sanding stick or a piece of sanding paper. Something 400 to 800 grit will work well for this purpose. And we just want to round it off and smooth that tip so that there aren't any sharp points. And so it just looks a little neater and cleaner. These sanding sticks are something that I use frequently, and I buy them from Rio Grande. They come in a pack, an assorted pack. There's 6 of them, and they range from 400 grit to 3,000 grit. These are really great for doing this type of touch-up. So, you know, touching up tool marks or a bald end that isn't quite perfect, you can touch that up. And they're just really handy to have around. I use them all the time, and they're pretty inexpensive. So again, look in the resource guide that's linked in the description below, and that'll include links to those sanding sticks as well as all the other tools that I'm going to be using today. Okay, all of my wires are clean, and now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and mark our wires. And this is just going to give us an idea where to start the weave, and also it's going to give us an idea of how to position the balls of these wires so that they're staggered around the bead. We don't want them all even because that just looks awkward. So we're trying to create that sort of falling rain kind of effect where we want drops that are not in line with each other on the bead. So just grab yourself a ruler, and we're going to measure from the end of the ball. This is my center core wire, so it's the one that's only balled on one end. And I'm going to measure from the tip of the ball to 2.5 inches and make a mark right there. So this pendant is going to be about 2.5 inches long. A little bit longer. It'll actually end up about 2 3/4 of an inch long by the time we add the bail. But this is our woven section is going to be 2.5 inches. Now, to determine where to mark your balled wires, most of my wires usually end up pretty close to the same length, but there's always one that's just a little bit taller. So I'm going to pick that taller, longer wire, and I'm going to mark that one. Again, position the tip of the ball at 0, and we're going to mark this one at 2 1/4 inches. So I'm using an 8 by 20 millimeter bead in this instance, and because that's a fairly tall bead, I'm going to stagger these tips 1/4 inch apart. So on this last wire, we're going to mark that one at 2 inches. And that's going to create this nice staggered effect here where we have all these balls coming down around the bead and sort of flowing, and notice that none of them are the same length. If you end up with wires that are exactly the same length, it just ends up looking a little bit awkward in this design. So that's why I go ahead and mark them, and you'll see in the next step as we start positioning this around the bead, you'll see how this is going to work out. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and thread our bead onto that center core wire, and we want the heavy end of the bead down, pointing down toward the ball, so it's going to look just like this. And you can see there where I made that mark at 2.5 inches. So now we're going to take our other 2 wires and we're going to line up those marks. So this is the one that I made at 2 1/4 inches, and then this is the one I marked at 2 inches. I'm going to line up those marks.
And do you see now how those wires are staggered on the bead? That's going to just make sure that not only these wires have some difference in position on the bead, but also when we bend the top ends of these wires down and wrap them around the bead, they're also going to be staggered. And then the best way that I've found to hold my wires while I'm weaving, I like to use my ring clamp. This is such a great tool. It's like having a third hand, and it's really easy to use. You just have this hardwood wedge and you just press that up in there and it grips your wires really firmly. So these wires aren't going to move, and that just frees up my hand and it allows me to concentrate on what I'm doing, which is weaving. So we're going to begin that weave next. Now for weaving, you need about 60 inches of 28 gauge dead soft wire to complete this pendant. Now I used to cut a piece of wire that was the length that I needed and just work with it that way, but I don't know about you. I have a cat who loves to chase wire tails and it got really aggravating fighting with my cat over my wire. So I started using these Kumihimo bobbins and I just love them. They're so handy. So these are typically used for making cord jewelry, but they work beautifully for wire as well. And I will link to these in the project resource guide. So just look for that link in the description. But I just wrap several feet, probably 100 feet or so of wire onto a bobbin, and I work off of that until I run out of wire. So in this case, you're going to see me using this bobbin. I don't use this in the written tutorial, but just keep in mind that this does really help. It helps keep your wire from getting tangled. It helps prevent kinks. It's just easier to manage. So I really do recommend using these bobbins if you have trouble keeping your wire kind of organized and neat.
As always, if you have any questions, just drop those in the comments below and I'll answer them as I see them.
So to begin, we're just going to start with about a 6-inch tail. I'm going to leave that for finishing the top of the pendant later. And I'm just going to go ahead and begin my weave with that lashing binding pass that I do. So I'm going once around each core wire. Go around the middle core wire. And once around the outer core wire. And that lashes my 3 wires together, and at this point I can go ahead and start my weave. And I'm just going to pinch these wires in just so that they line up kind of neatly. I want to keep these wires parallel as I'm weaving so I don't get too much of a, like a snake sort of motion. I don't want parts of my shaft to be wider than the others. Now that's just my personal preference. That's sort of an interesting look, so if you like that effect, you can certainly do that deliberately. But I personally like to keep mine nice and neat and try to keep my wires parallel all the time. So now you're just going to weave all the way down to the top of your bead. If you're unfamiliar with this weave, this is a modified figure 8 weave. And all I'm doing is, it's the basic figure 8, so it's an over-under sort of weave, but I am going twice around the outer core wires. So the way this weave works out is you end up making 2 full complete wraps around the outer wires, and then you're just going either under or over half of that center core wire on each pass. So there I just went under the wire. Now I'm going to go twice around this core wire, and I'm going to go over that center wire. Now something to keep in mind as you're weaving, and this is really important, you want to really keep your tension consistent all the way through from the top of the weave to the bottom. And the reason why is because tension really affects the twist on this design. So this is an excellent design to really start paying attention to your weaving tension and playing around with it. What you'll find is the looser your weave, the tighter you'll be able to twist your pendant. The tighter the weave, the fewer twists, I guess I should say, you'll get in your pendant. It just won't, a tight weave doesn't want to twist as many times as tightly, so you'll get a softer twist. And this is something, again, like I recommend that you make multiples of this pendant and play around with that and see what happens, because like I say, this is such a great way to learn to control tension. This pendant right here, I think I probably learned more about wire weaving tension making these pendants through the years than with any other design or project that I've ever done. And notice that as I go along, every 2 or 3 passes or so, I go ahead and compact my weave. Now you want to have a nice, neat, and compact weave on this pendant, because as you twist it, if it's not compacted, you're going to really sort of amplify that variation with the twist, because the twist will cause the wires to separate a little bit. So if you have a looser weave and you didn't compact your weave all the way from top to bottom, it'll spread out a little bit and it just won't look as neat and pretty. I really like to make these pieces as neat as I possibly can. I just think the neater your weave is to start with, the nicer your finished pendant is going to look. Now, as I get a little bit of this section woven, what I like to do is go ahead and take it out of my ring clamp and make sure that nothing has shifted. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to slide these wires up a little bit just so that they're peeking out just above the weave there, and I'm just going to realign those marks that I've made at the beginning. But we just want everything lined up nice and neatly at the top of the weave. And then I'm going to go ahead and put my ring clamp back on. I'm going to grip closer to where I'm weaving, and this just helps keep your wire shafts from getting bent. It just sort of keeps everything kind of neat and compact, and you're working in a smaller space. And you're just less likely to end up bending your core wires. So, you know, just try to keep your clamp, whatever you're using, whether you're holding on with your nylon jaw pliers or with your fingers, or you're using a ring clamp like I am, try to keep that clamp positioned as close to the leading edge of your weave as possible, and go ahead and adjust it every now and then. Don't be afraid to stop and reposition your clamp, because it really will make a difference in your weave. And you'll end up with a much neater, prettier weave by the time you're finished. And I'm just going to push those ends in there, just kind of form them around the bead a bit as we get closer to the bottom of our weave. We just want to conform those balled ends around the bead a bit. And I'm going to reposition my clamp one more time. You can see one of those wires slipped up quite a bit, so I'm just going to pull that down, and you just kind of pull on the ball and rotate a little bit, and it'll work its way down. There we go. That's better. Get your wire nice and compact while you've got everything open and exposed. And then I'm just going to put my clamp back on. Get down close to the bottom of that weave. And let's just finish off this weave quickly, neatly. And the nice thing about using these bobbins is it gives you options at the bottom of this pendant. You're going to see as we finish off this pendant, you may want to do more or less weaving to secure your balled ends around that bead. So by using a bobbin instead of pre-cutting your wire to length, you give yourself an opportunity to do some extra weaving around the bottom of this bead if you like. So I'm going to keep weaving until that bead is nice and snug up against that ball. So there we go. There's no more slack in that. So once I reach that point, I'm just going to wrap twice around that center core wire. And I'm going to go ahead and leave my wire. I'm not going to cut it. And that takes care of our weave. And now we're ready to begin the next step.
That concludes part 1 of the Twig Pendant Make-Along. And don't forget, if you have any questions about the tools I used or the materials where I found them, make sure you look in the description below for the link to the project resource guide. In part 2, we're going to complete the twist, and I'm also going to share more about how tension affects the twist. I'll show you some examples of loose weaves versus tight weaves, how that makes a difference, and how you can really sort of sculpt and refine a design just by managing your weaving tension alone. Part 2 will drop next week, so make sure you're subscribed to my channel and hit that notification bell so you'll be notified when that video becomes available. Until next time, wire weavers, go make something beautiful.